Hello and welcome, Bruchim Habaim, Ahlan Bikum, everyone, to this program of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. You're joining us for a conversation with Professor Amal Jamal about his new book, Reconstructing the Civic, Palestinian Civic Activism in Israel. This discussion is part of a year-long virtual lunchtime series on civil society and plurality in Israel. We're hearing from scholars about critical social and political issues and movements in Israeli society. In the first session, we heard from Hebrew University professor Michael Karayani about his book, A Multicultural Entrapment, Religion and State Among the Palestinian Arabs in Israel. And if you missed it, you can find the recording on our website, along with information about other upcoming talks in the series. And we'll put the link in the chat. And now we're honored to be joined by one of the most impactful and insightful scholars of Israeli society today, Professor Amal Jamal. Professor Jamal is professor and formerly the chair of political science at Tel Aviv University, and he also heads the university's graduate program in political communication. He's an extraordinarily productive scholar, having published, by my count, no fewer than 26 books. And his research fields include state structure and civic society, political democratization and civil liberalization, social movements, media consumption and identity, and minority nationalism and the struggle for civic equality. The discussion will be moderated by Daniel Zoughbie, who heads MENA 3D, the Middle East and North Africa Defense, Diplomacy and Development Initiative here at Berkeley's Institute of International Studies. Daniel works, among other things, on politics and social networks, and he recently completed a term as the vice chair of UC Berkeley's Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Let me note that in the latter part of their discussion, they'll draw on questions from the Q&A box. So please feel free to submit questions there at any time. And now, please welcome Amal and Daniel.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bamberger, for that introduction. And thank you, Professor Jamal, for being here with us. One of the great virtues, although there are only a few, of this moment in world history is that it makes it possible for us to look beyond borders and to connect with distinguished scholars like yourself. So thank you very much for being with us. I have in front of me your book, which I'm just going to sort of hold up here if my camera filter will allow. And I would just like to start off, I think, because we have a very diverse audience, coming from different backgrounds, both within academia and beyond, I'd like to just start off with some basic definitions. Your book is about the Palestinian Arab minority within Israel. And I'm wondering if you could just help us to understand more generally what the landscape is like and how you distinguish this particular area of focus from, say, focusing on populations within the city of Jerusalem who are, holders of Jerusalem residency, or in the occupied Palestinian territories. So could you just kind of help us to define, the subject of focus a bit further?
Yes, well, let me, dear Daniel, start with a great thanks for you and for everybody that has been working on organizing this wonderful conversation. Thank you very much for hosting me, and I'm very glad to be with you tonight, this afternoon, your time. Well, first of all, yeah, it's a complex reality. And as the title of my book tells us, I focused actually on the Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel, living within the Green Line, excluding actually Palestinians who live in beyond the Green Line, which means areas that were occupied by Israel in the 1967 war, including East Jerusalem, and of course the occupied territories, meaning the West Bank and Gaza, as well as the Golan Heights. All these live under the Israeli sphere of power, controlled by the state of Israel, but are not citizens. And therefore, I focused on the struggle that Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel run in order to actually redefine the meaning of citizenship and countering the way the state or the Jewish majority within the state of Israel has defined it so far. So this is actually the social group I'm focusing on, which means it's within the confines of Israeli legal system within the Green Line.
Thank you for that. And I think this sort of segues into my next question, which is really about what prompted you to write this book. And in particular, I'm interested if you could help us to understand a little bit about your own personal and professional academic and intellectual journey. You served as chair of political science at Tel Aviv University, director of the Arab Center for Media Freedom in Nazareth, and head of the Institute for Jewish-Arab Coexistence presently. How did you sort of end up writing this book?
Well, first of all, let me start with actually the fact that I'm an Israeli citizen and I'm a part of the Palestinian community. And I experienced actually the interaction between this minority and the state of Israel, including the Jewish majority, of course, on a daily basis. And the political struggle that has been running for 73 years since 1948 regarding the definition of the state as Jewish and democratic on the one hand, and the identity of the Palestinians who remained inside Israel after 1948 on the other. This struggle has taken different forms, and as a political scientist, I'm fully aware of the complexities of this reality. And therefore, I wanted actually, I followed in my studies in the past, the formal Arab politics inside the state of Israel. Since 1948, the Palestinians who remained in Israel decided actually to struggle for equal rights within the Israeli legal system and went for the Knesset elections. They are represented in the Knesset and so on and so on. But noticed actually that as a result of the political limitations put on political parties who run for elections, that more and more Arab leaders, intellectuals, and activists started actually to establish civil society organizations in order to do two things. One, to take care of fields of life that the state has neglected for a while and did not get enough attention from the state, on the one hand, and on the other, that they were not satisfied with limiting their political struggle with equal rights from within the formal system. And therefore, I noticed that a growing number of CSOs are being established. So it drew my attention, especially when comparing what's going on in Israel with other minority communities in the Western world, including the United States or Britain or France, Germany, and so on and so on. So I wanted actually to study this phenomena in order to better understand what are the main values and what are the main visions that the Palestinians are struggling for. How would they define their citizenship within the Israeli state? And I received a grant actually from the Ford Foundation to run this research back in 2005. Then I was elected as chair of the department, And so I did not have enough time to really pursue my study very much. And a year later, I was appointed as the head of the Alam Center, which is an NGO or a CSO, Civil Society organization in Nazareth. So actually, I had these two views. On the one hand, I am a practicing academic. On the other, I was involved in civic activism. And actually, I delayed publishing the book. As I said in my prelogue, I delayed the publication of the book until I actually finished my duties, so I would be able to have a more objective view of this experience. So the purpose of the book actually is to put on the table one of the most interesting and intriguing avenues of political behavior of minority groups in democratic systems struggling for civil rights and civil equality.
Now, this is obviously a book within the discipline of political science. There's a lot of very sophisticated analyses that are undertaken in the book. I'm wondering if you could just, for those in our audience who have not yet had the opportunity to read it, if you were to just summarize in a sentence or two for a lay audience what the main argument of the book is, that would be very helpful, I'm sure, for our audience.
Yeah, there are two tracks within the book that I try to follow in order to clarify the political struggle for equality conducted by Palestinian citizens. On the one hand, I wanted actually to look at the institutionalization process taking place among them of civil organizations that, as I said before, look for social and political change, and at the same time, how they interact with the Israeli state, how they interact with what's going on in Israel politically, claiming that the civic struggle taken by Palestinian civic organizations is seeking actually to expand the avenues in which Palestinian citizens can interact with the Israeli state, trying to reconstruct the meaning of citizenship, the meaning of civic virtues within the state of Israel, arguing that the way these ideals, these virtues were defined, were actually defined by the Jewish majority on the one hand, and they are limiting their maneuvering spaces and disabling them from integrating fully, not only as citizens, but also as political activists, trying to redefine the identity of the state in a way that would include them. Because the way the Israeli state has defined itself so far, legally, constitutionally, as Jewish and democratic, which excludes their identity, their history, their culture, and actually the civic struggle we are running through is actually trying to promote a new definition of the state in a way that would include their identity, their history, their culture on equal footing. This is the track I followed. And I think last comment, I think what I argued is that it's the space, the civic space, is the best space in which they would achieve such a goal, confining their struggle to actually civic struggle rather than limiting it to a national struggle. That's the relationship between the national and the civic is very complex, as we know, because they are part of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people is struggling for independence, and they wanted to actually try to change Israel from within what the Israeli legal system and constitutional system allows.
The focus on minority populations, I think, is a very important topic. And in the book, you indicate that by focusing, and I'm quoting you, quote, focusing on the politics of minorities' civic mobilization, we can better understand the complexities of the field of power. I just want to read that one more time because I think there's a lot that's packed into that one sentence, and I'd like to focus for a moment on it. Again, you argue that by, quote, focusing on the politics of minorities' civic mobilization, we can better understand the complexities of the field of power. I'd like to ask you if you could elaborate on that a bit further, and if I could just push you a little bit to perhaps help us understand if there's a useful distinction to be made within Israeli society concerning power on the one hand, and the field of authority on the other hand, and how an analysis of minority populations might help to inform that understanding further.
Well, let's start with the philosophical argument that if you want to understand political power, you have two options to look at. It's internal dynamics from the center, which means looking at institutional power, the formal institutions of the state. But if you are able to look at the power system from the margins, from those excluded from it, and here I'm following a line of thought promoted by political philosophers such as from Hannah Arendt up to Jacques Rancière, the French philosopher, looking through at the center of power from the viewpoint of those who are excluded, actually, from those who are not taking part in making or defining the meaning of the political system. And those excluded actually enable us somehow a different viewpoint that can shed light on how power works within the system. So I'm trying to argue that minorities, when they come to when they come to protect or struggle for equal rights, they could form a kind of seismograph for us to better understand the dynamics of power and how power works. And in the book, actually, I differentiated between the epistemology of compliance, which means that mainstream political science looked at the formal institutions and the extent to which different citizens comply to the system, the extent to which they accept or legitimize the system. And those who are, don't follow the formal politics are usually viewed as dissenters or deviators or illegitimate and so on and so on. I tried actually to say, take a different vantage point, saying that if we look from the margins of the system, we can better understand the complexities of power, meaning actually how the epistemology of compliance works, and how mainstream political science actually echoes the formal political system or the mainstream political system. And therefore, the book is actually criticizing not only the formal political system in Israel and the legal system as well, but actually also introduces a critical vantage point on how political science is conducted vis-a-vis minorities. So I try to do that, and the sentence you cited actually tries to argue that if we want to understand how power works in asymmetric reality, we better look from the margins of the system. Now, as regard to authority, I think, as we know, there's a big difference between the concept of authority and power. And I think I criticize the common Weberian definition of authority, which is a vertical type of authority. And I try to introduce a horizontal understanding of authority, saying that democratic systems speak about horizontal accountability, horizontal responsibility, and it's more tolerant. And the way example I use, which is the Palestinian civic activism in Israel, comes to say or comes to make a broader argument about minorities, not only in Israel, but everywhere, that if we want to better understand the systems of power, we better look from the vantage point of minorities. They can tell us better how the intrigues of power work in such systems.
I think this is a very important point that I'd like to just take note of before we move on, which is that there are really two things that you're doing in this book. And one is, of course, you're sort of helping us understand some very relevant and contemporary historical phenomena in Israeli society. But the other thing you're doing more generally is you're sort of making a theoretical contribution within political science, and you're really offering evidence to suggest that we can't have we cannot have an adequate understanding of power if we're simply focusing on those key individuals who seemingly shape events, whether within the context of a country or international affairs. And so I think this is a very powerful sort of bottom-up theoretical argument that you're advancing. I'd like to now turn sort of our attention to another topic, which you've alluded to, which is, on the one hand, to talk about kind of the exclusion of the Palestinian minority within Israel. And then the next thing we will do is look at the alternative explanation as well. So let's focus, first of all, on that first example, the exclusion that many Palestinian Arabs within Israel, again, we're focused on Israeli citizens, full Israeli citizens, the exclusion that many of them feel. You recently gave an interview lamenting the exclusivity generated by the nation-state law, and specifically mentioned the Druze Arab community. There are other kind of sub-communities within the broader Arab or Palestinian umbrella category. Could you help us just to understand, first of all, what the nation-state law is, just as an example, since that was something that you had identified, as well as sort of how these competing notions of self-determination play out? On the one hand, where there's the promise of equal potential for all citizens, regardless of their religious or ethnic background, and on the other hand, where there are these feelings of exclusion within Israeli civil society.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I think let's stop for a while on the concept of exclusion, because usually in Israel, formally as well as in the Israeli academia, people usually focus on the call that was made in the Israeli Declaration of Independence back in 1948, calling for the Arabs who remained in Israel to integrate in the state and help in building the state, which was defined as a Jewish state already then. this invitation, I think, is very important to look at because it entails the entire story. On the one hand, they have become citizens, and they were invited to be active citizens, loyal and active citizens in defining, in actually building the state. On the other hand, they were conceived as strangers within the Jewish state, because the way that the state was defined, or has been defined, as exclusively Jewish, means that they are not on equal footing with the Jewish citizens of the state. This is one level of it. The other level of the issue of exclusion is that here I follow Hannah Arendt speaking about vita activa and the meaning of action. And I come from an Aristotelian tradition, which views the political system as defined as a consequence of what the citizens actually in their daily interaction define together. And the fact that the vita activa of the Palestinians from the beginning was limited to certain areas, despite the invitation that was placed in the Declaration of Independence. Their invitation was limited to certain areas under the auspices of the definition and legal framework actually determined by the Jewish majority. And the majority rule that enabled the Jewish majority to define the constitutional identity of the state actually defined also the limited spaces in which the Palestinian citizens can play. And I think the mentioning of the nation-state law enacted only in 2018 is indicative of what I'm speaking about, which means that Israel defined or redefined itself again more than around 70 years, or exactly 70 years after its establishment, again as exclusively Jewish. Which means if the Palestinians are citizens, they have to accept their submissive position to the sovereignty or exclusive sovereignty of the Jewish majority, and any struggle against this identity or any attempt to redefine this identity would be considered illegal. So I tried actually to allude to this already in the book, despite the fact that I did not have enough time to elaborate on the book, and therefore. What I tried to say in the interview as well as in the book, that if we have thought that Israel has been liberalizing and becoming more and more democratic back in the 1980s and 90s, especially in the height times of the Oslo Accord, that we are going for a reconciliation between Palestinians and Israeli Jews, and the Palestinians are going to have an independent state, and the Jews are having their own. Suddenly, with the rise of the Likud to power back in 2009, and the dominant role that has been played by the previous Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, redefining the Israeli state as exclusively Jewish, limiting actually the ability of those who are not Jewish to take part in doing that. And the Druze case I mentioned is the extreme case, the best case to look at, because the Israeli state from the beginning had said this in this invitation back from the Declaration of Independence, that civic virtues are actually the access point to be part of the state of Israel. That those who pay army service for 3 years, men, and 2 years, women, could become full citizens. And the Jews since 1956 have been integrated in the Israeli army as compulsory service. And they have given all the duties that expected from any citizen in any state. They were willing to sacrifice their life for the sake of the state. And then when we look at what happened in the nation-state law, that Israel has redefined itself again as exclusively Jewish. Many Jewish citizens who are originally Palestinians, but have taken a different track vis-a-vis the Israeli state, have been closer to the Israeli state, suddenly found out that military service, paying taxes, being a good citizen, actually does not promise anybody to become equal citizen in the state of Israel. And I think this twist point has made it clear for any Arab citizen, as Arab Palestinian citizen, as well as many Jews, that the definition, the exclusive definition of the state as Jewish, in a narrow sense, is problematic. Now, let me, Daniel, just elaborate one last point, because this may mean for some that people, calling for redefining the state of Israel in a way that will be inclusive for everybody is actually abolishing the right for self-determination for the Jewish community. And actually, it's not. The Jewish community has its own right for self-determination. It has been practicing this self-determination for 73 years. And the argument is that, or the question is, whether the right for self-determination for the Jewish community has to be exclusive for non-Jews, no matter what they do, even if they pay the services and the duties imposed on them by the state. This is the question I pose, and I think the evidence we have is that there is a contradiction, or there's a tension between an ethnic definition of sovereignty and civic ideals and civic rights, and we have to reconcile the two in a way that enable everybody to feel at home in the state of Israel.
So I think that sort of brings up the opposite side of where I was hoping to go, which is that recently Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel have played an increasingly prominent role in Israeli society. Notably, we have the example of the former Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, being sort of dislodged from power. We have the involvement of Arab Palestinian citizen of Israel convicting a former president of the state. And we have major contributions within Israeli academia, business sectors, and the list can go on and on. I think where I'm going with this is I'm wondering, from a political science sort of framework, can we see the minority within a country? In this case, we're talking about Israel. Could we see that minority, if they are sort of integrated, as you say, given equal opportunity, given the same rights as other citizens, is there a sense in which that minority actually becomes fundamental to the stability of the state and can improve civic life and ultimately can improve the experience for all citizens at a national level? Or is that sort of, wishful thinking?
Well, first of all, we have to take into consideration that that the Palestinians have been struggling to become integrated. And I think what we have been seeing in recent time, the struggle between those who insist on excluding the Palestinians from being fully integrated in the Israeli political system, vis-a-vis those who actually would like to open new spaces for integration. And the current government, or the current coalition, includes an Arab party within the coalition for the first time in the history of the state of Israel. So it's a new experiment. And what has been said, or is being said by many, most Arab politicians in the Israeli Knesset, that only through the integrating of the Palestinians in Israel Israel can become fully democratic on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Jewish community can feel safe because this also may mean finally solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That the threat to the Israeli state is not actually only a security threat, not only from Iran or from the outside, it's also from disintegrating from within, the differences within the Israeli Jewish society, because the cleavages are not only between Palestinians and Jews, it's also between the Jews themselves, between ultra-Orthodox and secularists, and between right-wingers and leftists, between those who believe in open market and those who pay the price for the open market, and so on and so on. So what has been is being said is that the integration of the Arab community within the system, within the formal system, could actually better express the will of the people, could be more inclusive in order to enable at least 20% of the Israeli society to feel more at home in the political system. But let us clarify that the book I wrote is not only about the formal system, it's also about the civic activism that is struggling actually for not only full integration in the formal system, but also in Israeli society in general, in legitimizing the Palestinian identity within Israel, legitimizing their way of life. Let me note, Daniel, that almost 50% of the Palestinian community in Israel live under poverty line. That the exclusion I spoke about before is in all realms of life, including allocation of resources. That when you look at the infrastructure in the Arab towns vis-a-vis the Jewish towns, you see great gaps that have been established or created in the last 70 years. And the struggle is actually to change the priorities of the state, arguing that if this continues this way, if more and more people, not only Palestinians, but also people in the periphery of the state of Israel feel excluded from the allocation of resources, yes, the stability of the state is in a problem. And I think many Israeli politicians, leading politicians, have reiterated this point, that the danger for the state of Israel, the state of Israel is a leading country economically, technologically, militarily, and so on and so on. So Israel can defend itself vis-a-vis the outside. I think we have to look at the internal issues and look at the internal dangers that could erupt as a result of the tensions within the Israeli society, and the May events, May 2021 events that have taken place in mixed towns like Lod, like Ramle, like Yafo, like Akko, and so on and so on, is only an example of what could happen if the tension continues and is built up. Therefore, we have to decompose this very sensitive tension in a way that we allow more and more people to be included and feel part in defining their way of life, and defining the way the state allocates its resources, and symbolically as well as materially.
Thank you very much for that insight. I'm wondering if you could expand on this notion of citizenship within the context of our conversation about reconstructing the civic. In some ways, there's a tension here, right, between the idea of nationhood, on the one hand, including the history, the unique culture, and identity that many people who are Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel feel, and at the same time balancing this within a state that is committed to, as you noted, the concept of Jewish self-determination. How does that play out? What are the barriers to sort of having both of these ideas exist within the same sort of civic space that is being reconstructed. And importantly, maybe if you could even draw on a context outside of the Middle East conflict. So the thought that comes to mind is, you know, commitment to Arab nationalism while still feeling very sort of committed to the Egyptian state or to the Iraqi state or to the Lebanese state. So could you talk a little bit more about sort of that balance and the potential barriers and solutions to that?
Yeah. Let me start by going to Europe for a while.
Yes.
And taking France as an example.
Okay.
In France, for instance, if you have a French citizenship, you are part of the nation, the French nation, which means there's a full overlap between being part of a nation and being citizen. Now, in the United States also, you're part of the American nation if you are an American citizen. Whereas in Israel, we don't have an Israeli nationality. We have, Jewish identity, Jewish nationality, Jewish nationhood, and we have, Palestinian or non-Jewish in this context. So not having an Israeli nationality has been confirmed not only by the political system or the legal system, but also by the judicial system in an appeal that was discussed about 5 years ago, in which Israeli Jewish citizens asked the court to issue a verdict imposing on the Interior Ministry to register them as part of the Israeli nation rather than part of the Jewish nation, because in the Israeli registrar, people are registered either as Jews or as Arabs or other nationalities under the rubric of nation. And the court said that there is no Israeli nationality in the sense of nationhood. There is Israeli citizenship. There is Jewish nation and there's other nations, in this case, Palestinian nation. Now, I think this is part of the problem, that this gap between what we see in modern liberal states, what we call civic nationalism, which means that the nationalism is defined by the state as inclusive nationalism for everybody. And in this case, Israeliness, rather than Jewishness or Palestinianness. Now, you can come with a question, wait a minute, what about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Is this possible? Now, of course, in the given reality we live in now, given the tension, given the conflict, given the political burden we live, or most people live in, it's not easy. But if we look at a future vision, I think it's the only way to deal with the tension we live in, with the impossibility of Jews and Arabs, Arab Palestinians living or feeling at home. And therefore, that's why I differentiated between the rights for self-determination and exclusive control of the state. I think if we don't differentiate between this and that, I think we are doomed to continue in the same bloody conflict. The citizenship has to be defined by the citizens, and the sovereignty had to include everybody who lives within the confines of the sovereign. And it's not the reality in Israel today. It hasn't been since Israel was established. And therefore, we have to actually struggle for this change in order to enable everybody to feel at home. And I'm mentioning home in the sense of living in the place that both peoples treat as home, as well as living at home in the sense of being part of the state. For the state to be inclusive, for the state to be a home for everybody, it has to be redefined in a way that is inclusive for everybody, that include everybody's culture and society and language and heritage and nationhood and so on and so on. That's what I mean by it.
You know, in some ways, as I'm hearing you comment on this, and I don't mean to sort of put words in your mouth, but in some ways you're sort of challenging at a theoretical level the very concept that I think is very, very widespread around the world, the very concept of self-determination itself. And maybe what you're encouraging us to do is to perhaps rethink this concept a bit in light of the idea of the civic. And I think that's a very important thing to do. And you mentioned Europe, and just a number of different examples are coming to my mind where the concept of self-determination, while very important, is increasingly causing a number of complications with respect to the politics of Europe and the European Union, with respect to the future of the United Kingdom, the future of Scotland, the situation with Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Even if we look to Spain or Italy, there are even echoes of this. So I think it's a very important thing that you're sort of pushing us to do, which is to sort of question these categories and to think more broadly about what citizenship means, both within Israeli society and beyond, and what it means for an individual to take part in constructing, or as you put it, reconstructing that civic space. I'd like now to turn to some questions that I've received from the audience. The first one is as follows. At Berkeley last month, Professor Kariani spoke about the ways that what through certain lenses might be understood as liberal recognition of group religious rights in Israel, religious self-determination of different groups, that this can lead to a loss of individual rights that might promote not just freedom, but also equality. Can you talk about your experience of how a potential tension between group and individual empowerment plays out with regards to the reconstruction of the civic, for good or for bad?
Well, let me say that I believe in the devolution of power. I believe in the sovereignty of groups and individuals in determining their way of life. And we know from the history of political thought that there is a genuine and serious tension between group rights and individual rights. And I think we have to strike the balance. And I think that we have enough examples worldwide in which peoples manage to actually strike a certain balance. Now, let me just make a comment before I go ahead, saying that there are no sacred political concepts. Human beings have conceptualized reality, and they conceptualize reality in certain circumstances. But these circumstances change, and we have to change also the way we conceptualize reality and we organize reality. So at certain point in history, yes, we created the nation state, but the nation state is not sacred. It is a container of safety. It has been, but also as a source of war and bloodshed. So I think we have to opt for a better reality in which we try to strike a balance between group rights, individual rights. And if I may use a close example to you guys, I mean, not speaking only about the United States, about Canada. If we look at Canada as an example, it has been struggling to strike a balance, and it's managing actually to find a certain way of balancing between recognizing group rights, recognizing cultural rights and political rights for the French and the indigenous minorities within it, and vis-a-vis, of course, the English majority. I think this is one example. If we look at the processes taking place in New Zealand, vis-a-vis the Maoris and their integration in the parliament and recognizing the culture. I'm not saying it's a heaven. I'm not saying that this reality has reached, the best possible end. But I'm saying, political processes are taking place, and we should try to strike a balance between the attempt of certain minorities to protect their way of life and have their values legitimized and recognized by the state, vis-a-vis, of course, two things. One, individual rights and individual autonomy. And Will Kimlicka, the Canadian philosopher, has tried to define and managed to define actually the limits in this regard, and that granting collective rights has to guarantee the ability of the individual to opt out to the general public sphere in cases that their rights are infringed on. This is on the one hand, individual rights. On the other hand, we don't want to disintegrate the state. We don't want to actually put people in danger by the dissolution of the state. So the state has to play a role. And this balance between individual rights, group rights, and state security is very important to keep in order to enable people to live in safety. But the state cannot, as you know from the American Constitution, the state cannot define for people how to live, what beliefs are prioritized, what way of life is better than another, and so on and so on. The space is given to the individual and to groups to nourish their culture, live their way of life, recognized as legitimate by the state within the confines of universal law that guarantees equality for everybody. Now, this balance is not easy. I'm not arguing that it is easy, and especially in a state like Israel, which has been living in a national conflict with a nation whose part live within that state as citizens. This complexity is really unique, but I think that's why it's interesting to think through the Israeli case in order to rethink the nation state, to rethink citizenship and the balance between them.
This raises another question that I have, which is, in many ways, this is a very unique case. But I'm wondering if there are any lessons that could be drawn from your book to, say, other parts of the world, other parts of the Middle East, where there are conflicts involving self-determination, involving complex religious and ethnic divides. Does anything come to mind that could be informed by this discussion? Could we create some linkages, or do you feel like the Israeli case is too unique to generalize?
Well, one of the best comparable examples is what's going on in Turkey and the Kurds. I think this is a very interesting case. We have a Kurdish minority within the Turkish state, defined as a nation state, and the tension between the rights of the Kurds on an individual as well as collective level, vis-a-vis the constitutional definition of the state as Turkish. The Alawites in Turkey also is a minority, a religious minority that has been suffering as a result of the way Sunni Islam has been dominating the Turkish state. So, and it's very close to us, and we can learn a lot from what's going on in both places when we compare between them. But if I take you far from here, let's go to Sri Lanka, for instance, and the civil war that took place for a long time, and ended up tragically there, but still as an example of the the historical notion, I won't say the fact, the historical notion that minorities, cultural minorities, discriminated against minorities, don't give up on their rights easily. And they will always struggle in order to be integrated and recognized on equal footing in their states. So I think the Israeli example provides us with how this is done within a democratic political system. Unlike what's going on in other neighboring Arab states. Like if we look at Egypt, not really democratic, it doesn't have really democratic system. But when we look at the Christian minority there, the Copts vis-a-vis the Muslim majority, the Muslim Sunni majority, and the relation between them, I think co-opting a minority in a way that disregards its right for equal participation in the political system, using actually, I don't want to go into Egyptian politics too much, but I think I think when we compare Israel to other Arab states, whether Egypt or what happened in Syria, the civil war in Syria, that you cannot maintain minorities under a suppressed system of power forever. That at some point things can erupt in a way that are not desired for, and therefore I think somehow enabling the discussion, enabling an open space in which minorities can air out their grievances and struggle for equal rights, I think is better than non-democratic systems. This we can learn from Israel, although I have to admit that Israel within the Green Line is running a democratic system, but we have to take into consideration that Israel controls also Palestinian areas that are not part of the democratic system, and that's why I'm saying it's a unique case in which democracy is utilized for non-democratic decisions, for promoting a non-democratic control system and power system. And I think that's why I think the transformation of Israel to something else that is more inclusive could save us a lot of headache in the future.
We have another question, just asking if you could briefly address the question of the various Arab Palestinian political parties within Israel. Could you just give sort of a brief overview and help us understand what that landscape looks like?
Yeah, definitely. I will start from today. Today we have actually, let me start with the concept, differentiating the concept of political lists and political parties. It's complex a bit, but political lists could be a combination of parties running for elections for the parliament. So within the Israeli Knesset today, we have two main Arab lists. One is the joint list, composed of 3 political parties, and we have the Islamic Party, which is composed of one political movement, actually, with individuals joining it. These are the 2 main political agents, Arab agents within the Israeli parliament. But historically, we can speak about 3 to 4 political trends within the Palestinian Arab community inside Israel running for elections. One is the communists that have been part of the Israeli political system already from 1948. We have the nationalists, which were excluded from taking part in the Israeli political system back in the 1950s and 60s. Gathered and redefined themselves and came back into the system in 1984 in the progressive list, and later on in the Balad Party, the National Democratic Assembly, back in 1996. This is the national trend. We have the Islamic trend that did not participate in the Israeli political system until, formally at least, until 1996 also. In 1996, the Islamic movement was split based on this issue. Part of it started participating in the political system, and part of it boycott the Israeli elections. This part that joined the system in 1996 is part of the Israeli coalition today. And the fourth stream is actually those Palestinian Arabs who are part of the Zionist parties, who run within Zionist parties, whether in the Likud or in the Labour Party, in Meretz, and so on and so on. So these are the main trends within the system, and they sometimes join, sometimes redefine themselves, but these are the mainstreams.
We have another question about the nation-state law specifically. Just to sort of bring it home for an American audience, the question is really about what specific rights have Arab Israelis lost due to the nation-state law. Maybe you could give us a few examples and just help us to understand the differences between an Israeli citizen who is of Palestinian Arab origin and an Israeli citizen who is of Jewish origin.
Well, first of all, let me start with the way the state has been defined within the law. And I said before, it has been defined as exclusively Jewish and expressing actually the right for self-determination of the Jewish people. It defines who the sovereign is. And this contradicts with what we mean by democratic sovereignty. Because in democracy, the sovereign are the citizens. Whereas the nation-state law defined the sovereign as the Jewish people, meaning that even Jews who live outside the state of Israel are potentially part of the sovereign, excluding citizens who live in the state. Now, what does this mean practically? Let's look at the Arabic language. The Arabic language has been defined in the Israeli law since 1948 as an official language. Official language meaning has an equal footing with the with the Hebrew language. For the first time, the nation-state law redefines the status of the Arabic language from an official language into a language with a unique status to be defined by the law, which means degrading the status of the Arabic language, meaning also that if until the nation-state law, an Arab citizen could have come and asked legally for a document to be translated from Hebrew into Arabic by an official, state institution, or could have spoken in Arabic in the High Court legally, I'm not sure that this is the case anymore. We still don't have enough experience with the law, say more than that. But I think that the changing of the status of the language is a case to look at. The second example is actually establishing exclusive Jewish settlements. The law has been, very sophisticatedly formulated. But actually, when we look at it, it recognizes, and it says it clearly, that the state views Jewish settlements to be of unique status, not recognizing Arab settlements or Arab towns to be of the same status. That settling, establishing Jewish settlements, Jewish towns, because the concept of settlements is referred usually to the occupied territories. So let me speak about places of residency for Jews in Israel is viewed as strategically as well as an important virtue that the state of Israel has an authority and responsibility to promote, without mentioning that there are 20% of the Israeli citizenry who are not Jews. So what about the status of their settlements, of their towns, of their villages? Should not be promoted by the state, should not be recognized by the state, should not be treated equally by the state. I think when we look at the law in these two examples, we can see the problematics that are contained in the law. Now, let me just be optimistic about it, despite the critique. The High Court, the Israeli Supreme Court, actually discussed the legality or the constitutionality of the nation-state law. And it decided to intervene and review the law and to confirm the law with a majority, a vast majority. The only judge actually who criticized the law was an Arab judge who is the only Arab inside the Israeli Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, first of all, that we didn't have enough experience with the law to come and say that it's unconstitutional. But we have many scholars speaking about the unconstitutionality of the constitutional procedures made in acting the law. So we will have to wait and see. I'm not saying that the law changed the entire Israeli reality. I think it's a mark that I wrote about, differentiating between the Declaration of Independence I mentioned before and the nation-state law. The Declaration of Independence, as I said before, included an invitation for the Arab citizens to integrate and become part of the state, which means leaving the horizon open for integration. The nation-state law closes these horizons, in my view. Tells the Arab citizens you can never be equal citizens anymore. That's why the struggle was so tense against the law, because constitutionally it says that if you were invited in the past and you hope to become full citizens, and the Jews, as an example, who served in the army, hope that they can become equal citizens in an unforeseen future. The future horizons for equality has been closed. And that's why the struggle today in Israel, among the Palestinians as well as liberal Jews, is for enacting a constitutional law, a basic law for equality, to balance the nation state. The struggle for equality is the main struggle in the state of Israel today.
I think that's a very interesting point that you're raising, and I just sort of want to highlight it, which is that in many ways, it sounds to me at least, that you're not simply arguing against the nation-state law, which is very recent. You're in essence arguing for, a founding document of the state, and arguing that this recent law, in fact, conflicts with that essential founding document. I think that's a very interesting way to look at it and to frame the debate. We have to finish up at 1:55, so we have one more question that I'd like to present to you, and that question is really about Palestinian integration in the Israeli state, in the context of those Palestinians who live outside of the protection of Israel. They're not Israeli citizens. Maybe they're Jerusalem residents or living in the West Bank or Gaza or perhaps elsewhere, as you've noted. Can these two sort of nations that are competing with one another actually exist in a way in which the civic and this new idea of civic identity, or the reconstruction of civic identity, ultimately prevails?
Well, first of all, they have no choice, Daniel. They are not going to evaporate. We are speaking about 7 million Jews in Israel and about 6.5 million Palestinians living between the Jordan River and the sea. They have to reconcile somehow. And I think as long as both sides, but since we are talking about Israel as a powerful side, insisting on exclusive ethnic definition of the power system, I don't think they can reconcile. I think that's why I go for the reconstructing the civic, in the sense that, and I'm not talking about a certain solution. I avoid speaking about either one state or two-state solution. I'm not going into that. I'm a political theorist. I'm trying to, at least trying to define a virtuous, ideas and values that enable us then to go and ask how we can institutionalize these values and these virtues. And the civic horizon that is inclusive, that is equal, that should be universal, that should enable every community, including, by the way, and emphasizing it, because the platform on which we speak, which is important for me to emphasize, including the Jewish majority within the Green Line, to feel secure, feel at home. But for it to feel secure, it has to open up for a new definition of the way Palestinians and Jews live together. And since we have to look for the long future and not leave the ground so tense for the next generations, I think we have to look for formulas, new formulas, and think out of the box in order to enable both sides to live, to feel at home.
Well, I think it's just left for all of us to thank Professor Jamal for what was a fascinating discussion. I again encourage everyone to pick up a copy of his new book, Reconstructing the Civic, Palestinian Civil Activism in Israel, published by SUNY Press, State University of New York. I encourage you to read it carefully and thoughtfully. And I will just finally turn things over to Professor Bamberger to wrap up the event, and again to thank the Institute for hosting.
And I want to say thanks so much to Amal and Daniel for such an engaging and deep conversation. Thank you, Amal, for sharing some of your vision with us. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. Before we close, I just want to flag our upcoming November events. We're going to have later this month our first two events in person after a year and 3 quarters. On Tuesday, November 16th, we'll host the Lebach lecture on Israel and the Great Powers, looking at Israel in the case of Russia, with Anna Borshchevskaya in conversation with Professor Ron Hassner, and couldn't be more timely as Prime Minister Bennett returned not too many weeks ago from his first meeting with Putin in Russia. And on Thursday, November 18th, we'll host a conversation between Batya Unger-Sargon and Professor Ethan Katz about Unger-Sargon's new book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, as part of the Program on Anti-Semitism Education Initiative at UC Berkeley. In addition, please look out for session 3 and 4 of this series on civil society and plurality, and they'll take place virtually in February and March. Please see the Helen Diller Institute events page for more information on these and for upcoming events. And please join me in thanking our 2 speakers. Thank you, Amal. Thank you, Daniel. Take care.